60 riders, painted for war, silent as fog rolling over the Mule Mountains at first light, the copper-stained ridgeline burning red behind them, and not a sound except the steady percussion of hooves on hard pan. Bisbee's main street emptied in 11 seconds. Doors slammed, shutters locked. A woman dropped a basket of washing and left it in the dust. The riders did not look at the town. They rode past it, past the saloon, past the assayer's office, past the bank, and descended into the valley where the copper company had its claim markers. They formed a half circle around the mining camp and stopped. 60 horses, 60 men. Not one weapon drawn. The foreman sent a boy running for Cornelius Marsh. The boy came back 20 minutes later, breathing hard, and said only this: "He's coming. He's bringing the judge." Subscribe to Frontier Reckoning. This story has 5 parts, and the part that will stay with you is still ahead. But to understand how we got there, you need to go back 2 days. The cowboy was broke. Not the kind of broke a man tells stories about later. The kind with a saloon to sit in while he waits for the end. This was the other kind. The kind where the horse is thin, the saddle blanket is the only blanket, and the last of the food is a strip of dried venison, half a biscuit from a stage stop 2 days back, and enough coffee grounds for 1 cup if you use the grounds twice. He had ridden south from Tucson, through country that had nothing in it but heat and mesquite, and the distant shimmer of rock that would not grow a thing. The job that brought him south had ended the way some jobs end. Not with payment, but with the understanding that the people who owed him were not going to pay, and the people who needed him were already beyond his reach. So he rode. The horse chose the direction. It always did when he had no particular reason to go anywhere. The Mule Mountains rose ahead of him, raw, copper-tinted, cut through with dry washes that carried water only during the monsoon. It was November. Those washes had been dry for months. He had been following one for the better part of an hour, letting the horse pick its footing along the loose stone when the animal stopped. Not a hesitation, not a flinch, a full stop, legs planted, ears locked forward, nostrils wide. The cowboy looked at the wash ahead. Dry sand, flat stones, the skeleton of a cottonwood that had died years ago. Nothing visible. But the horse's ears had fixed on a point about 40 yards ahead, where the wash bent around a shelf of limestone. He had learned, long before this ride, to trust the horse's eyes over his own. He dismounted, looped the reins over a mesquite branch, and walked. Around the limestone shelf, in the narrow strip of shade the cliff cut into the afternoon, he found them. An old man sitting against the rock wall with his legs straight out in front of him, motionless. The way a man sits when standing is no longer something his body can reliably do. His face was deeply lined, the skin drawn tight over the cheekbones, his eyes still open but focused on something far away or long past. Beside him, pressed against his left side, a boy of perhaps 15, shirtless, ribs visible, watching the cowboy with the specific wariness of someone who has learned that strangers do not bring good things. On the old man's right, a smaller boy, 8 or 9, asleep or unconscious, his head in the old man's lap, his hands curled around nothing. The old man looked at the cowboy. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. He did not speak. He simply looked, the way a man looks at weather, knowing it will do what it does regardless of his preference. The cowboy sat down across from them. Not close, not far. He unstrapped the food from his saddlebag, the strip of dried venison, the half biscuit, the small leather pouch of coffee grounds, and laid them on the flat stone between them. The older boy's eyes moved to the food. His jaw tightened. He did not reach. "Divide it," the cowboy said. The old man looked at the food. then at the cowboy, then at the smaller boy in his lap. "You know what this is," the old man said. His English was clear, accented, deliberate. "This is the last you have. I know what it is. You will be hungry tonight. I've been hungry before." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then, with hands that moved slowly but without shaking, he took the venison and tore it into 3 strips, one for each grandson. He tore the biscuit in half and gave both pieces to the boys. He did not take any for himself. The older boy ate the way a person eats when hunger has become a permanent resident, carefully, without looking up, as if someone might take it back. The younger one woke when the biscuit touched his hand. He ate without opening his eyes fully, still halfway in whatever dream had been kinder than this wash. The old man watched them eat. Something moved through his face, not emotion exactly. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has been trying to keep 2 children alive on nothing and has just been given 3 more hours of hope. "My name is Tsela," the old man said. "These are my grandsons, Koda, Etu." The cowboy nodded. "You ride through Apache land," Tsela said. "Most whites who ride through here carry guns and orders. You carry half a biscuit. Where's the rest of your family?" The question sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Tsela's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. A door closing, not to hide what was inside, but to keep the weather out. "The mining company," he said. "Marsh. His men came to our village 6 months ago. They said the land was no longer ours. They had papers, a charter from the territorial recorder. They said the copper under our feet belonged to the company." He paused. "Then they burned 3 houses. Then they poisoned the water in the South Canyon. Then they came back and burned 2 more. "How many families?" 6. We were the last. The others moved north to the reservation. I did not. This valley was my father's, his father's. I will not leave it." "Where are the others now?" "Dead, sick, gone." He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. "My son, their father, went to the mining camp to argue. He did not come back. They said he was arrested for trespassing on company land." He looked at the cowboy with eyes that had nothing left to hide. "He was not arrested. He was buried. I know where." The younger boy, Etu, had finished his biscuit and fallen back asleep, his cheek against his grandfather's knee. Koda sat very still, watching the cowboy with the kind of attention that comes from having no other protection. The cowboy looked at the ground around the wash. He saw the boot tracks, deep-heeled, fresh, American-made boots, not moccasins, 3 or 4 sets, walking the perimeter of where the family sat. Someone had been here recently. Someone was watching. "Marsh's men?" he asked. "They come every 2 days, Tsela said, "to see if we are still alive. If we are gone, the land is empty and the charter covers it. If we are dead, nobody files a claim. And if you stay, they will come again, soon, perhaps tomorrow." The cowboy looked at the tracks, then at the dry wash, then at the horse, which had not moved from its position at the mesquite branch, ears still forward, still fixed on the bend in the wash, as if it could hear something the man could not. "How soon?" the cowboy asked. Tsela's eyes moved to the ridgeline. "When the sun is there," he said, pointing to a point just above the western peak. "Dusk? They prefer dusk. They say it is safer." The cowboy followed his gaze. The sun was already halfway to that point. He stood up. He put the empty leather pouch in his saddlebag. He checked the rifle. Lever action, wooden stock. The action clean from the last time he oiled it, 2 days ago. He looked at the horse. The horse looked back at him with the specific expression of an animal that already knows what is about to happen and has accepted it. "The wash bends around that limestone," the cowboy said. "How many men will they send?" "Last time 4. Before that, 3. They are not soldiers. They are men who were paid to be cruel." "But Dillard leads them." Tsella's jaw tightened at the name. "Hank Dillard. He was a scout. He knows this ground." "What about the younger one, Teague?" "Floyd Teague." Coda spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a 15-year-old who has been practicing restraint because the alternative is something he cannot afford. "Teague is the one who burned the house with my mother's loom inside." The cowboy looked at the boy. Coda looked back without blinking. "Stay in the wash," the cowboy said. "Behind the limestone. Don't come out until I come back for you." He untied the horse from the mesquite and led it up the wash, away from the family, toward the shelf of rock that overlooked the bend. He found a position, a narrow ledge with a clear line of sight down the wash in both directions, enough cover from the limestone to break up his silhouette, and a rock wall behind him that eliminated the possibility of approach from the rear. He settled in. He laid the rifle across his knees. The sun dropped toward the ridge. The shadows lengthened across the wash. Below him, Tsella sat with his grandsons in the last strip of daylight, and the old man's hand rested on Coda's shoulder, and the younger boy slept, and the copper-tinted mountains turned the color of old blood. The cowboy waited. He had no food left. He had barely enough water for himself, let alone 4 people. He had a horse that was too thin, a rifle with 30 rounds, and the absolute certainty that the men coming up this wash at dusk had made a calculation about the value of the lives below, and found them worth less than the copper under their feet. The horse's ears shifted, not forward this time, to the side, toward the southeast, where the wash opened into the wider valley. Someone was coming. The cowboy's hand moved to the rifle's lever. Not with urgency, with the calm familiarity of a man who has performed this particular motion enough times that his muscles do it without consulting his mind. The sun touched the ridge. The boots in the wash would be here in minutes, and the cowboy, who had no food, no money, and no reason to be in this country at all, settled into the limestone shelf and watched the entrance to the wash with the patience of a man who has already decided how this ends. The hooves came first, not the sound of a man riding at speed, but the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone leading a horse up a dry wash in failing light. Then boots on stone. Then the faint rasp of leather, a saddlebag strap, or a gun belt shifting. Dusk had bled out of the sky 10 minutes ago. The wash was full of shadow now, the limestone walls cutting off the last trace of daylight overhead. The cowboy counted the sounds. 2 horses, that meant 2 riders mounted. Behind them, on foot, heavier boots, the kind with thick heels that slapped rock instead of gripping it. 3 men walking. 5 total. 1 more than last time. Marsh was investing in this visit. From the ledge, he watched the entrance to the wash. The first figure to appear was on horseback. A large man, wide through the shoulders, riding with the loose, rolling posture of someone who had spent years in a saddle and no longer needed to concentrate on staying in it. He carried a carbine across his thighs. Behind him, a second rider, younger, leaner, sitting his horse the way a man sits when he wants everyone to notice the pistol on his hip. Floyd Teague. Even in the failing light, the cowboy could see the boy's jaw working, chewing something, tobacco or his own nerves. Behind them, 3 men on foot. Laborers from the mining camp, not professionals. Their rifles were held wrong, barrels pointed at the ground, bodies hunched forward with the posture of men who had been told to follow orders, and did not like the orders but liked their wages more. Hank Dillard led them around the limestone bend with the confidence of a man who had made this walk before. He knew where the old man would be sitting. He knew the shape of the wash, the depth of the shade, the exact distance from the bend to the shelf where Tsela and the boys would be huddled against the rock. He knew all of this the way a man knows the floor plan of a house he has already robbed, mechanically, without curiosity. What he did not know was that there was a ledge 15 feet above him. What he did not know was that the horse tied to the mesquite branch 50 yards back was not a wild animal that had wandered into the wash. It was tied with a specific kind of knot, the kind a man ties when he intends to come back for it. What he did not know was that the strip of dried venison that had bought the old man's trust 3 hours ago had also purchased the knowledge of exactly when and how these men would arrive. Dillard reined up at the bend. He looked at the shelf where Tsela should have been sitting. The shelf was empty. "Where?" Teague started. Dillard raised one hand. The gesture was small, almost lazy, but the 3 men behind him stopped moving. Dillard's eyes swept the wash. Left wall, right wall, the dry sand, the cottonwood skeleton, the limestone shelf. He was reading the ground the way a scout reads it, looking for what changed, not what was there. His gaze moved up the left wall of the wash, slow, methodical, and for a moment, his eyes passed over the ledge where the cowboy lay motionless against the rock. They did not stop. The cowboy did not breathe. Dillard turned his horse in a slow circle. "Old man," he called. His voice was calm, conversational, the voice of a man who has delivered bad news so many times it has lost its charge. "Mr. Marsh sent us with an offer. Last one. You take the reservation allocation and ride north, or we stop offering." Silence from the wash. Teague's hand drifted to his pistol. "Maybe the coyotes got him." "Shut up, Floyd." "I'm saying, I heard what you're saying. Shut up." Dillard swung down from his horse. He landed quietly for a man his size. He walked toward the limestone shelf, boots crunching on dry sand, and crouched where Tsela had been sitting 3 hours ago. He touched the rock. It was cold, no body heat. He looked at the ground and saw the impressions where 4 people had sat. The old man's widespread legs, the teenager's compact crouch, the smaller boy curled in a ball, and a 4th set. Boots, not moccasins. American boots. Dillard stood up very slowly. "Somebody was here," he said. "Tracks?" Teague asked. "Boots, not ours." One of the laborers shifted his weight. The sound of his boot on gravel was absurdly loud in the silence. "Spread out," Dillard said. "Check the upper wash. He might have moved them to—" The cowboy spoke from the ledge. "Don't reach." 3 words. They fell into the wash, like stones dropped into a well. Every head turned upward. Dillard's hand, which had been moving toward his carbine, stopped at the level of his belt buckle. Teague's fingers, already wrapped around his pistol grip, went still. The 3 laborers looked up at the ledge and saw, in the last thin light, the outline of a man lying prone with a rifle, the barrel tracking downward at an angle that made the geometry of the situation immediately and mathematically clear. "I'm going to say this once," the cowboy said. "The old man and his grandsons are under my protection. That protection extends to this wash, the ridge above it, and every acre of valley floor between here and the copper claim. You have been told to burn them out. The man who told you that is Cornelius Marsh. He operates under a territorial mining charter that was filed 18 months ago. That charter is fraudulent." Dillard's eyes had not left the ledge. He was calculating angles, distance, the time it would take to bring the carbine up, the likelihood that a man shooting from a prone position at this distance in this light would miss. The calculation took about 4 seconds. The answer was not encouraging. "You a lawman?" Dillard asked. "No." "Then what gives you the right to—" "I'm not claiming a right. I'm stating a fact. The surveys Marsh filed to support that charter were forged. The boundary lines were redrawn to include 6 Apache family plots that had been occupied continuously for 30 years. That's not a territorial matter. That's a federal one. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Mr. Dillard. And so do you. That's why you're here at dusk instead of noon." That landed. The cowboy watched Dillard's posture shift, not dramatically, just a subtle redistribution of weight from the balls of his feet to his heels. A man who had been leaning forward into a confrontation was now leaning back into a decision. "Who are you?" Dillard asked. "A man who shared his dinner with a starving family and didn't appreciate what he found." "Marsh will send more men." "Marsh can send whoever he likes. I'll be here." "You can't watch this wash forever." "I don't need to watch it forever. I need to watch it long enough." Dillard studied the ledge for a long moment. Then he looked at Teague. Teague's hand was still on his pistol. Dillard shook his head. Once, barely visible. "Ride," Dillard said to his men. He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, keeping his hands visible, away from the carbine. He turned the horse toward the wash entrance. As he passed below the ledge, he stopped. "Marsh will hear about this by morning." "Tell him something else for me." Dillard waited. "Tell him I've seen the original surveys." The sentence hung in the wash. Dillard's face, in the last trace of twilight, showed nothing. But the cowboy had been watching men's faces long enough to read the specific micro-movement of a jaw muscle that tells a man his bluff has been called. Dillard said nothing. He rode out of the wash. Teague followed, and the laborers followed Teague, and in 30 seconds the wash was empty except for the sound of hooves receding down the valley. The cowboy did not move from the ledge for another 10 minutes. He listened to the hooves fade. He listened to the wind pick up across the ridgeline. He listened to the specific quality of silence that returns to a place after violence has been narrowly avoided, a silence that is heavier than the one that came before, because now it contains the knowledge of what almost happened. Then he climbed down, retrieved the horse, and walked back to the limestone shelf. Clara was sitting exactly where he had been before, one grandson under each arm. The old man looked at the cowboy with an expression that was not gratitude. Gratitude is too small a word for what a man feels when someone stands between his grandchildren and the end of everything. "You said you have seen the original surveys," Clara said. "I haven't. Not yet." "But you told them you had." "I told them I had, because by tomorrow I will." Clara considered this. The way he looked at the cowboy, steady, unhurried, weighing, was the look of a man who has survived 70 years by learning to distinguish between the kind of white man who makes promises and the kind who makes plans. "Where will you find them?" The cowboy looked south, toward Bisbee, where the last light was a red wound on the horizon. "There's a surveyor in town, works for Marsh." "If he works for Marsh, why would he help?" "Because she's been keeping copies of everything for a year. She's just been waiting for someone to ask." "How do you know that?" The cowboy did not answer. He was already untying the horse. He left Clara and the boys in the wash with the horse standing guard. The animal would alert them to any approach long before human ears could detect it. He walked the 3 miles to Bisbee in the dark, following the wagon road by starlight, moving at the steady, ground-eating pace of a man who has walked long distances in the dark before and knows that rushing is the enemy of arriving. Bisbee at night was a different town than Bisbee in daylight. In daylight, it was a copper mining settlement, raw, loud, full of men with pickaxes and contracts and territorial ambitions that exceeded their judgment. At night, it was a handful of oil lamps behind curtains, the smell of wood smoke and ore dust, and the distant thump of the stamp mill that ran 20 hours a day. The saloon was still open. The general store was closed. The assayer's office had a light on the second floor. He found the surveyor's office on the east end of Main Street, a narrow building between a feed store and a boarding house, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Land Surveys and Territorial Claims. C. Holt." The door was locked. The window was dark. He tried the door again, more carefully this time, feeling the mechanism. Old lock, cheap hardware, the kind that responded to patience rather than force. He had it open in under a minute. The office was small: a desk, a drafting table, 2 filing cabinets, and a wall covered in pinned survey maps. He lit the oil lamp on the desk and began to read. Clara Holt was not what the name on the sign had suggested. The handwriting in the field notebooks was precise, small, methodical. The handwriting of someone who measures the world in chains and rods and does not tolerate approximation. The notebooks went back 3 years. The filing cabinets were organized by section, township, and range, the federal survey system used for all territorial land claims. He read for an hour. Then 2. The pattern emerged slowly, the way a watermark emerges from paper when you hold it to the light. Every survey Marsh had filed with the territorial recorder showed the same anomaly. The southern boundary of his mining claim had been drawn to include a strip of land, roughly 600 acres, that did not appear in the earlier surveys. The earlier surveys, filed under different names and different section numbers, showed that same strip as occupied Apache land, homesteads, water sources, and seasonal camps that predated the mining charter by decades. He opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It was locked. He picked it. Inside, a canvas satchel wrapped in oilcloth containing a second set of survey maps. These were originals, hand-drawn, field-measured, with annotations in the same precise handwriting as the field notebooks. They showed the true boundary lines. Marsh's claims stopped at the ridge, and everything below it, the valley floor, the washes, the copper seam, belonged by continuous occupation and federal survey precedent to the Apache families who had lived there for 30 years. He was still reading when the door opened behind him. The woman in the doorway was tall, angular, in her 40s, wearing a man's work shirt tucked into canvas trousers, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She held a lantern in one hand and a short-barreled shotgun in the other. She looked at the cowboy, then at the open filing cabinet, then at the maps spread across the drafting table. "Those maps are mine," she said. "I know." "And you're in my office?" "I know that too." She set the lantern on the desk. She did not lower the shotgun. She looked at him the way a person looks at an equation that has just produced an unexpected but not unwelcome result. "You're the one who ran Dillard out of the wash tonight," she said, not a question. "Word travels." "Dillard came into the saloon an hour ago, looking like he'd seen a ghost that could shoot. I put the pieces together." She paused. "How did you know I had the originals?" "Because the surveys filed with the recorder are wrong, and somebody had to have made the originals before they were changed, that somebody was the surveyor, and the surveyor kept them, because that's what a person does when they've been forced to falsify records. They keep the truth in a drawer and wait." "Wait for what?" "For someone to open the drawer." Clara Holt looked at him for a long time. Then she set the shotgun against the wall. She sat in the chair across from the desk and pulled one of the maps toward her, the one that showed the valley floor with the Apache homesteads marked in red ink. "I've been Marsh's territorial liaison for 4 years," she said. "I mapped every claim, every boundary, every water source in this valley. When he bought the mining charter, he needed the boundaries redrawn to include the Apache land. He told me the families had already agreed to relocate. He showed me transfer documents with tribal marks." She paused. "The marks were forged. I found out 6 months later, when one of the families came to my office with the original deed, a federal homestead certificate from 1862 that predates the charter by 20 years. 1862. Under the original territorial survey, before Arizona was even a territory, the Apache families settled that valley under a federal land grant that was never revoked. Marsh's charter cannot supersede a prior federal grant. It's basic land law. But the territorial recorder didn't check, and the families didn't know they had the right to challenge it, and She stopped. "I was afraid. Marsh has men. You've met 2 of them." "I've met 2. How many does he have?" "At the mining camp. 8. In town. The sheriff is bought. The assayer is bought. The territorial judge who approved the charter is a friend of Marsh's from Prescott." "And the federal Indian Affairs agent at Fort Huachuca?" "He's 2 days' ride away. And he doesn't know any of this is happening, because nobody filed a complaint. Nobody knew where to file." The cowboy looked at the maps on the table, the originals and the forgeries side by side, telling the same story from 2 different angles, one true, one profitable. "If I ride to Fort Huachuca," he said, "how long before the agent can be here? If you ride tonight, you could reach the fort by tomorrow afternoon. If the agent leaves immediately, he could be here by the morning after." 2 days. The dawn after next. That was the window. "If I take these maps, I'll give you the originals. I'll give you my field notes. I'll give you the forged surveys and the transfer documents with the false tribal marks. I kept copies of those, too. Everything you need to prove the charter is worthless." He looked at her. "You kept all of it." "I kept all of it because I've spent 1.5 years hoping someone would ride into this town who wasn't on Marsh's payroll and wasn't afraid of Dillard." She met his eyes. "I was starting to think it wouldn't happen." He gathered the documents, the original surveys, the field notebooks, the forged transfer papers, the false tribal marks. He wrapped them in the oilcloth and put them in the canvas satchel. It was heavy with the weight of evidence accumulated over years of one woman's quiet refusal to let the truth disappear. "I need to reach Chief Nantan," he said. Clara's expression changed. "Nantan doesn't trust whites. He has no reason to. Marsh's men have been telling him for 2 years that the government authorized the removal. He doesn't know the difference between a territorial charter and a federal grant. To him, it's all the same paper. Someone will need to vouch for me." "Who?" "Tsela, the old man in the wash. He knows Nantan. Tsela is starving in a ditch. How is he going to—" "Because I fed his grandsons my last meal. And according to his own words, a man who gives his last food to an Apache's children will not lie to that Apache's chief." Clara stared at him. The lamp on the desk flickered, casting moving shadows across the survey maps, the true boundaries and the false ones, overlapping like 2 versions of the same world fighting for the same space. "You're betting everything on a meal," she said. "I'm betting everything on what the meal means." He stood. He rolled the maps and slid them into the satchel. He blew out the lamp. At the door, he turned back. Clara Holt was still sitting in the chair, her hands flat on the drafting table, her face half lit by the lantern she had brought. "Marsh will come for you when he finds out," he said. "Marsh has been coming for everyone in this valley for 4 years. I've been sitting in this office waiting for someone to give me a reason to stop letting him." She looked at the empty drawer where the originals had been. "I think you just did." He walked out of the office and into the Bisbee night. The satchel was over his shoulder. The rifle was in his hand. The stars were out over the Mule Mountains, hard and bright, the way stars are only in country that has no light to compete with them. He had the documents. He had the evidence. He had a woman who would testify, and a set of original surveys that made Marsh's mining charter a lie written on expensive paper. But documents do not stop men with torches, and dawn was less than 20 hours away. Marsh would hear about the confrontation in the wash by morning. He would send more men, not 5 this time, but all 8, and Dillard would lead them, and the lesson of the ledge would not hold a second time. The cowboy had one option that could stop the burning before it started. It was the option Clara had said was impossible. It required walking into the camp of a man who had every reason to kill any white person who approached, presenting documents that meant nothing without the context of the law behind them, and asking that man to trust the word of a stranger who had shared one meal with a dying elder. He looked south, toward the foothills where Nantan's band was camped. Then he looked at the satchel. Then he started walking. The horse, still tied to the mesquite branch in the wash 3 miles behind him, watched the empty trail with ears that did not move. It had seen him walk toward difficult things before. It always waited. It always knew he would come back. But there was something in the angle of his shoulders as he disappeared into the dark, the specific set of a man carrying the weight of documents that could either save a valley or get him killed by the people they were meant to protect, that made the animal shift its weight and exhale through its nose in a way that, in a horse, is the closest thing to worry. The cowboy walked south through the November dark with the satchel over his shoulder and the rifle in his hand, and the Mule Mountains rose around him like the walls of a cathedral built for no congregation he belonged to. The terrain was rough, limestone shelves, dry arroyos, the kind of ground that punished a man for walking too fast and punished him just as badly for walking too slow. He had walked this kind of country before. The trick was not to think about the destination, but about the next 10 yards. The rock that would turn under his boot, the creosote bush that would mark a turn in the wash, the distant star he was using to keep his bearing. The destination would arrive, or it would not. The next 10 yards were always within his control. He found Nantan's encampment 2 hours before dawn. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke, faint, drifting through a narrow canyon that cut into the foothills like a blade stroke. He stopped at the canyon's mouth and stood still. A dog barked once, then stopped. The smell of horses, many horses, drifted down the canyon on the cold air. He did not walk in. He sat on a limestone boulder at the canyon's mouth, laid the rifle across his knees with the barrel pointed at the sky, and waited. They came for him within 10 minutes. 2 men, young, moving through the scrub with a silence that made his skin tighten. Not from fear, but from professional respect. These were men who had learned to move through their own country the way water moves through rock, finding the gaps, using the shadows, making no sound that was not intended. They had rifles, old ones, military surplus, the kind acquired from trading posts and dead soldiers, and they carried them with the ease of men who had used them more than they had cleaned them. They did not speak English. One of them gestured with his rifle barrel, not threateningly, but with the authority of a man who knows exactly how much space belongs to him and how much belongs to the stranger sitting at its edge. The cowboy stood slowly. He held the satchel out in front of him, not surrendering it, but making it visible. He pointed to the satchel, then to himself, then down the canyon. He said one word, "Tsiela." The 2 men exchanged a look. The name meant something. One of them said something in Apache, a short phrase, a question. The other answered. Then they gestured for him to walk. They led him down the canyon, single file, the cowboy in the middle with a guard in front and a guard behind. The canyon opened into a small basin, perhaps 200 yards across, sheltered on 3 sides by rock walls, with a thin trickle of water running along one edge. He counted the lodges, maybe 15. Canvas and hide stretched over wooden frames, arranged in a rough circle around a central fire that had burned down to coals. Horses were picketed along the far wall. He counted those too. 40, maybe more. Some of them were saddled. This was not a permanent camp. This was a war camp. The saddled horses meant riders who were ready to move. At the center of the basin, by the dead fire, sat a man who was neither old nor young, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the mountains, hard plains, deep lines, eyes that reflected the coals without absorbing their warmth. He wore a mix of traditional and American clothing, a wool shirt under a hide vest, cotton trousers, moccasins. His hair was long, tied back. He had no weapon visible, which told the cowboy that he either did not need one or had several within arm's reach. Chief Nantan did not stand when the cowboy was brought before him. He did not gesture for him to sit. He looked at the stranger the way a man looks at a wolf that has wandered into his camp, assessing distance, intention, and whether the kill was worth the noise. The cowboy set the satchel on the ground between them. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible, and opened it. He pulled out the original survey maps, still wrapped in oilcloth, and laid them on the ground. Then the field notebooks. Then the forged transfer documents with the false tribal marks. He arranged them in a line, the way you arrange evidence for a jury. Nantan looked at the documents. He did not touch them. His eyes moved to the cowboy's face. "Tsela," the cowboy said. He pointed north toward the wash. "Tsela sent me." Nantan said something in Apache. One of the guards answered. A rapid, low-voiced exchange. Nantan's expression did not change. He looked at the documents again. Then he spoke. His English was rough, heavily accented, the English of a man who had learned the language from soldiers and traders and had never had a reason to soften it. "Tsela does not send white men to me. This one he did. Tsela is dying in a wash. His grandsons are starving. Why would he send a stranger to me instead of sending for food?" "Because food will not save his land. These will." The cowboy pointed to the maps. Nantan's eyes followed his finger, then returned to the cowboy's face. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that exists between two men who are both trying to decide whether the other is telling the truth, not because they want to believe, but because the cost of being wrong is measured in lives. "Marsh says the government gave him this land," Nantan said. "He has papers. He shows them to me every time his men come. He says the papers mean I must leave. The papers are lies. All papers are lies. White men write lies on paper and call it law. These aren't Marsh's papers. They're the original surveys, measured before Marsh existed, before his charter existed. They show that your families have been on this land for 30 years. Under federal law, that means the land is yours. Marsh's charter cannot override a prior federal claim." Nantan was quiet for a long time. The coals in the fire pit shifted, sending a thin curl of ash into the still air. Somewhere in the camp, a horse stamped and blew. "Who are you?" Nantan asked. "A man who shared his food with Tsela's grandsons." "That is not an answer. It's the only one I have." Nantan looked at the guard on his left. They spoke in Apache, a longer exchange this time, with pauses, the rhythm of a conversation that carried weight. The guard's eyes moved to the cowboy several times during the exchange. When they finished, Nantan turned back. "My man says you ran Dillard out of the wash tonight. He says you were on the ledge above them and you spoke to them, and they left." "That's right. Dillard does not leave. He left tonight." Because you had a rifle. Because the math was wrong for him. Nantan studied the cowboy's face, the way a man studies the sky before a hunt, looking for patterns, reading what was there and what was missing. Then he looked down at the documents. If these maps are true, he said slowly, then Marsh has been stealing our land with paper, and you have brought me paper to take it back. I've brought you proof that the land was never his to take. Proof. Nantan tasted the word as if it were something unfamiliar. Proof is for courts. Courts are in towns. Towns are where Marsh lives. I do not go to towns. You will not have to. I'm going to the town. But I need to know that when I do, your people are still here. I need to know that Marsh doesn't burn your camp while I'm gone. Nantan's eyes hardened. Nobody burns my camp. They have burned 5 of your homes. They poisoned your water. They are coming back at dawn with everything Marsh has, and they will burn whatever is left. They will try. They will succeed unless someone stops them, and I cannot stop them from Bisbee. The silence again. This time it lasted long enough for the coals to settle and the canyon wind to shift. The cowboy felt the cold seeping through his shirt. He was hungry, genuinely hungry, the kind of hunger that comes from giving away your last meal and then walking 6 miles through rough terrain in the dark. What do you want from me? Nantan asked. Time. I need to ride to Fort Huachuca and bring the federal Indian Affairs agent. I need his authority to override Marsh's charter. That will take 2 days. In that time, Marsh's men will come to the wash where Tsela is waiting. They will come to your camp. They will try to finish what they started before the law arrives. And you want me to stop them? I want you to make sure they cannot. Nantan stood for the first time. He was taller than the cowboy had expected. Not in height, but in presence, the way a man becomes larger when he stands in his own territory and knows that everything within sight belongs to him by right of birth and blood, and 30 years of continuous occupation. You want me to go to war, Nantan said. I want you to go to the valley, not to fight, to be seen. If Marsh's men come and find 60 warriors in the valley, they will not burn anything. They will ride back to Bisbee. They will tell Marsh. And Marsh will have to decide whether to escalate against a force he cannot beat or wait for the law to arrive. And if the law does not arrive, then we deal with that when it happens. Nantan looked at the documents on the ground. He crouched slowly, and for the first time touched the maps, not the forged ones, but the originals. His fingers traced the boundary lines, the red-inked homestead markers, the surveyor's neat notations. He could not read the English words, but he could read the shapes, the valley, the washes, the ridgeline, the creek. These were features he had known since childhood. They were drawn accurately. This woman, Nantan said, the surveyor, she measured these? She did. And she kept them hidden for a year. She was waiting for someone to bring them to you. Nantan looked up from the maps. Something had shifted in his expression. Not softening, but the arrival of a different kind of calculation. Not whether to trust the stranger, but whether to trust what the stranger had brought. My son, Nantan said quietly. Tsela's boy, the one who went to the mining camp. The cowboy said nothing. They killed him. Buried him somewhere near the stamp mill. I know this. Tsela knows this. Nantan's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who has carried grief so long it has become structural, load-bearing, like the beams of a house. When I ride into that valley, I do not ride for paper. I ride because a man gave my brother's grandsons his last meal, and that man is standing in my camp asking for time. That is the only reason. He turned to the guard and spoke in Apache, a rapid sequence of commands, the kind of speech that allocates men and horses and assigns positions with the precision of a military officer who has done this before. The guard listened, nodded once, and disappeared into the camp. In 10 minutes, the camp was moving. Men emerged from lodges, pulling on boots and belts, checking rifles, saddling horses. There was no shouting, no urgency, just the quiet, practiced efficiency of a people who had been preparing for this kind of moment for 2 years and had simply been waiting for the reason. Nantan looked at the cowboy one last time. "Ride," he said. "Get your federal man. I will be in the valley by dawn. If Dillard comes, Dillard will find something he did not expect. If Marsh comes, Marsh will find something he cannot buy." The cowboy gathered the documents, returned them to the satchel, and walked out of the canyon the way he had come, through the narrow entrance, past the guards, into the dark. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could hear the camp behind him, the creak of saddle leather, the murmur of horses being calmed, the specific rhythm of an entire community mobilizing for a purpose it had been denied for 2 years. He walked 3 miles back to the wash. The horse was exactly where he had left it, tied to the mesquite branch, ears forward, watching the darkness with the patient alertness of an animal that has been alone too long and is ready to move. Tsela was awake. Kota sat beside him, alert, a knife across his knees. Etu slept, curled in a ball, his breathing thin and even. "You found Nantan," Tsela said. "I found him." "He will come?" "At dawn." Tsela closed his eyes. Something moved across his face, the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for so long that releasing it is almost painful. His hand found Itu's shoulder and rested there. "I told you," Tsela said quietly. "A man who gives his last meal to an Apache's children will not lie to that Apache's chief." The cowboy did not respond. He was already checking the rifle, counting rounds, calculating the ride to Fort Huachuca and back. The math was tight. 2 days there and back, pushing the horse hard through rough country, arriving with the federal agent before Marsh could organize something worse than Dillard and 5 men. He mounted the horse. The animal felt the weight shift and turned its head, ears swiveling, reading the cowboy's intention through the angle of his legs and the tension in the reins. "Stay in the wash," the cowboy told Tsela. "Nantan's riders will pass through the valley before sunrise. You will hear them." "We will hear them," Tsela said. "Apache horses are not quiet when there are 60 of them." The cowboy turned the horse south. He had 60 miles of rough desert between him and Fort Huachuca, and the darkness was beginning to thin along the eastern ridgeline. Not dawn yet, but the first suggestion that dawn was thinking about it. He rode. He pushed the horse hard through the pre-dawn hours, following the wagon road toward the fort through country that was flat, scrubby, and indifferent to human ambition. The Mule Mountains receded behind him, copper-tinted even in the gray light, and the desert ahead opened in a long, pale expanse of mesquite and hardpan that stretched toward the San Pedro River Valley. He crossed the river at a shallow ford an hour after sunrise, water reaching the horse's belly, the current cold enough to tighten the animal's muscles and make it shake its head as it climbed the far bank. By noon, he was in open desert south of the Dragoon Range, pushing the horse into a ground-eating trot that covered territory, but cost energy. He stopped once, briefly, to let the horse drink from a seep he knew from previous rides through this country. A thin trickle of water emerging from a crack in a sandstone shelf, barely enough to fill a canteen, but enough to keep the horse moving. He did not drink himself. He was not being noble. He simply did not think of it. Fort Huachuca appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon, a cluster of adobe and timber buildings arranged around a dusty parade ground, the American flag hanging limp on its pole in the windless air. It was a cavalry post, active, with the specific energy of a military installation tasked with containing a problem it does not fully understand. The guards at the gate were young, bored, and immediately suspicious of a civilian rider arriving from the desert on a horse that looked like it had been running all day. "I need to see the Indian Affairs agent," the cowboy said. "Agent Whitfield is on post. What's your business?" "Federal land matter. Urgent." The guard looked at the satchel, the rifle, and the horse's condition. He made a decision and waved the cowboy through. Agent Elias Whitfield was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with the permanently sun-squinted expression of someone who has spent 20 years reading documents in a territory that does not produce shade. His office was a small adobe room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a map of southeastern Arizona pinned to the wall with enough colored markers to suggest an ongoing argument with the territory's geography. He looked up when the cowboy entered and did not invite him to sit. "State your business." The cowboy set the satchel on the desk and opened it. He laid out the documents in the same order he had arranged them for Nantan: original surveys, field notebooks, forged transfer papers, false tribal marks, and stepped back. Whitfield did not touch them immediately. He looked at the satchel, then at the cowboy, then at the documents. His expression was the expression of a federal official who has been presented with evidence before and has learned to withhold judgment until the evidence proves it deserves attention. "Where did you get these?" "From the surveyor who made them. Clara Holt. She's been Marsh's territorial liaison for 4 years. She kept the originals when Marsh ordered the boundaries redrawn." "Marsh." Whitfield said the name with the flat familiarity of a man who has seen it on reports. "Cornelius Marsh. Mining and cattle. Bisbee operations." "That's right." Whitfield picked up the first map, the original survey showing the Apache homesteads in red ink, the true boundary lines, the 30-year occupancy markers. He held it to the light from the window and traced the section lines with his finger. Then he picked up the forged version, the one filed with the territorial recorder, and laid them side by side. The difference was obvious even to a layman. The southern boundary of Marsh's mining claim had been redrawn to include 600 acres of occupied Apache land. The original surveys showed those 600 acres as homesteads, water sources, and seasonal camps that predated the charter by decades and predated Arizona's territorial status by 4 years. "This is a federal homestead certificate from 1862, Whitfield said, picking up the oldest document, issued under the original territorial survey, before Arizona was even organized as a territory. He looked at the cowboy. "This predates Marsh's charter by 20 years. 20 years. The Apache family settled that valley continuously from 1862 to the present. Under federal law, that's prior occupancy. It cannot be overridden by a territorial mining charter. It can be overridden if the territorial recorder approved the boundary amendment. The boundary amendment was based on forged transfer documents. Those are the ones with the false tribal marks." The cowboy pointed to the papers at the end of the line. Marsh told the recorder the families agreed to relocate. He fabricated transfer papers with forged Apache marks. Clara Holt has field notes documenting the forgery. She measured the marks against authentic tribal documents and found they matched no known Apache hand. Whitfield was quiet for a long time. He read through the field notebooks, Clara's precise, methodical handwriting, documenting each measurement, each discrepancy, each date. He compared the original surveys to the forged ones. He examined the false tribal marks with a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, holding each paper to the light. Then he set everything down and looked at the cowboy. You understand what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to enforce federal Indian land protections that already exist. The families have prior occupancy under a federal grant. The mining charter is void. It was void the moment it was filed, because it was based on forged documents that purported to extinguish rights that can only be extinguished by a federal proceeding. That's correct. But Marsh has a territorial judge in his pocket, a bought sheriff, and 8 armed men at the mining camp. If I ride into Bisbee with a federal order, his local protection will challenge my jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction is federal Indian affairs. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act gives you authority over disputes involving Indian lands, regardless of what the territorial recorder approved. A territorial mining charter cannot supersede a prior federal homestead grant. That is the foundational principle. You do not need the territorial judge's cooperation. You need to present the original documents and invoke federal precedents. Whitfield stared at the documents on his desk. The afternoon light through the adobe window fell across the survey maps, illuminating the red-inked boundary lines that told the truth about who owned the valley. Lines that had been drawn by a woman with a measuring chain and a conscience, preserved in a locked drawer for 4 years, waiting for a man to carry them to the one office that had the authority to enforce them. "I'll need a cavalry escort," Whitfield said. "If Marsh has 8 armed men and a hostile sheriff, I'm not riding into Bisbee with a briefcase and a prayer." "How many men can you bring?" 10, maybe 12. That's what I can spare without leaving the fort undefended." "That's enough. Marsh's men are enforcers, not soldiers. If they see federal cavalry, the calculation changes." Whitfield studied the cowboy's face. The dust, the exhaustion, the specific quality of certainty that comes from a man who has walked 60 miles through desert to deliver documents that might save a valley, or might get him killed, and has not yet considered the possibility that the effort was wasted. "You ate today?" Whitfield asked. "No." "There's a mess hall. Eat. Sleep. We ride at dawn." The cowboy ate in the mess hall. Salt pork, beans, hard bread, the specific meal of a military installation that has solved the problem of hunger without solving the problem of flavor. He ate slowly, the way a man eats when his body has been running on nothing for 2 days and needs to be reintroduced to the concept of food gradually. He thought about Tsela in the wash. He thought about Koda's knife across his knees. He thought about Etu sleeping with his cheek against his grandfather's knee, his hands curled around nothing. He slept 4 hours on a cot in the barracks, the satchel under his head, the rifle within reach. The horse was in the fort's stable, fed and watered for the first time in days. At first light, he was mounted and waiting at the gate when Whitfield rode up with 11 cavalry troopers, young men, armed, sitting their horses with the alertness of soldiers who have been told they are riding into a situation that could go several directions. They rode north. The desert passed beneath them, the same desert the cowboy had crossed alone 2 days before, but different now, because he was not alone, and the documents were not in a locked drawer, and the math had changed. The troopers rode in a loose column, 2 abreast, carbines across their saddles. Whitfield rode beside the cowboy, reading through Clara's field notes as they moved, holding the notebook open against his saddle horn with one hand while the other managed the reins. "Who is this woman?" Whitfield asked at one point, without looking up. "A surveyor." "She's more than a surveyor. These notes are forensic. She documented every change, every date, every signature. She cross-referenced the forged tribal marks against 3 separate collections of authentic Apache documents." He closed the notebook. "She's been building a federal case for 4 years. She's been waiting for someone to carry it." They crossed the San Pedro River at midday. The horse remembered the ford and picked its way across without guidance, water splashing against the stirrups. The Mule Mountains appeared on the horizon an hour later, copper-tinted, familiar, rising from the desert floor like the spine of something ancient and unfinished. As they approached the foothills, the cowboy held up his hand. The column stopped. Ahead, on the wagon road that led into the valley, a figure stood. Not riding, standing in the middle of the road, motionless. A man. Apache. Young, lean, carrying a rifle across his chest with the ease of someone who has been holding it for hours. The trooper's hands moved to their carbines. Whitfield raised his own hand. Hold. "That's one of Nantan's scouts," the cowboy said. "He's been watching the road." "How do you know?" "Because Nantan said he would be watching." He rode forward alone. The scout did not move. When the cowboy was 20 yards away, the scout spoke. In Apache, a short phrase, a report. The cowboy did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, the calm, measured delivery of a man relaying information that is exactly what was expected. The scout looked past the cowboy at the cavalry column. His expression did not change. He said something else in Apache, then pointed toward the valley. The cowboy rode back to Whitfield. "Nantan's in position. 60 riders around the mining camp. Marsh hasn't tried anything yet. He's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For me to leave so he could burn the camp without witnesses. But I did not leave, and now there are 60 warriors between his men and the Apache families, and he has been sitting in his office trying to decide what to do about it. He knows about the cavalry? He knows something is coming. He just doesn't know what." They rode into the valley. The first thing the cowboy saw was the smoke from the mining camp. Thin, white, the smoke of cook fires and boiler stacks, rising straight up in the windless afternoon air. The second thing he saw was the copper claim markers, wooden stakes with red flags, marching across the valley floor in a line that stopped exactly where Clara's original surveys said it should stop, and extended 200 yards further where the forged version claimed additional territory. The third thing he saw was the warriors. They were not clustered. They were spread across the valley in a wide arc, mounted still, positioned at intervals along the ridgeline and the valley floor, with the geometry of men who understand how to control territory without firing a shot. Every approach to the mining camp, the wagon road, the creek bed, the ridge trail, was covered. The horses stood motionless, ears forward, the riders as still as the limestone they sat above. The mining camp was quiet. The foreman and Marsh's men were inside the compound. The cowboy could see them through the gaps in the timber walls, moving between buildings with the jerky, restless energy of men who have been surrounded for 2 days and have not been told what to do about it. Whitfield looked at the warriors. He looked at the mining camp. He looked at the cowboy. "This is going to be interesting," he said. They rode down the valley toward the mining camp. The warriors watched them pass without moving, 60 pairs of eyes tracking the cavalry column with the stillness of predators evaluating whether the newcomers were threats or tools. The troopers felt it. The horses felt it. The cowboy felt it too, but differently. He had sat in Nantan's camp 2 nights ago and been evaluated by those same eyes and found acceptable. The evaluation had not changed. He could feel it in the way the nearest riders did not shift their weight or adjust their weapons as he passed. He looked up at the ridgeline. Nantan was there, mounted, motionless, watching the approach. Beside him, on a smaller horse, was Tsela. The old man was not in the wash anymore. He was upright, his grandsons flanking him, and even from a distance the cowboy could see that Koda had traded his knife for a rifle. They had come down from the wash. They had joined Nantan's riders. They were here. The cavalry column stopped 200 yards from the mining camp. Whitfield dismounted, followed by the cowboy. The troopers remained on horseback, carbines across their saddles, positioned in a line that faced the camp. Whitfield walked toward the camp gate. The cowboy walked beside him, the satchel over his shoulder. The gate opened. Cornelius Marsh came out. He was a large man, not fat, but substantial, the kind who fills a room not through height, but through the confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who could enforce it. He wore a dark frock coat over a white shirt, the clothes of a businessman, not a miner. His boots were clean. His hands were uncalloused. He had the face of a man who spends his days in an office and his evenings at a table with a territorial judge, and who has never once had to make a decision while looking at the consequences through a rifle sight. Behind him, Hank Dillard. The former scout was carrying his carbine at half-port, the barrel angled toward the ground, his eyes moving between the cavalry troopers and the warriors on the ridgeline with the calculation of a man who has been in bad positions before and is currently adding this one to the list. Floyd Teague was behind Dillard, one hand on his pistol, jaw working, eyes darting. Marsh looked at the cavalry. He looked at the warriors. He looked at Whitfield. "Agent Whitfield," Marsh said. His voice was calm, measured. The voice of a man who has been negotiating with authority his entire life and sees no reason to stop now. "I was not expecting a federal visit. I imagine you were not." Whitfield's voice carried no warmth. He was a federal agent who had been presented with forged documents, false tribal marks, and a pattern of displacement that amounted to systematic theft under federal law. He was not here to negotiate. "These are my operations," Marsh said, gesturing toward the camp. "Filed and approved by the territorial recorder. I have a mining charter filed 18 months ago that your mining charter is based on forged boundary surveys, fraudulent transfer documents bearing false tribal marks, and the systematic displacement of Apache families who hold prior federal homestead grants dating to 1862. Whitfield's voice did not rise. "It did not need to. I have the original surveys, the field documentation, and the surveyor's sworn account of the forgery. Your charter is void. It was void the moment it was filed, because it claimed territory already held under federal grant." Marsh's expression did not change. He had been in rooms where authority was invoked before. He had survived those rooms by knowing which authority was local and could be bought, and which was federal and could not. "Agent Whitfield," Marsh said, "with all due respect, the territorial recorder approved my boundary amendment. That approval is binding within the territory. If you have a dispute with the recorder's decision, the proper venue is the territorial court." "The proper venue," Whitfield said, "is whatever court has jurisdiction over Indian land disputes under federal law, and that is not a territorial court. It is a federal one. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act gives the Federal Indian Affairs Office exclusive jurisdiction over disputes involving Indian lands. Your territorial recorder has no authority to approve a boundary amendment that extinguishes Indian occupancy rights. That authority belongs to the federal government alone." Marsh's jaw tightened. "Not much, but enough." "The families agreed to relocate," Marsh said. "I have transfer documents. Your transfer documents bear forged tribal marks. The surveyor who worked for you, Clara Holt, documented the forgery. She compared the marks to authentic Apache documents and found they matched no known tribal hand. She kept the originals. She kept everything." The silence that followed was the specific quality of silence that falls over a negotiation when one party realizes that the other party has been holding cards that were not supposed to exist. Marsh's eyes moved to Dillard. Dillard's expression had not changed. He was still calculating, still reading the terrain, still adding columns of numbers that were not producing the results he wanted. "This is my land," Marsh said. "I have invested—" "You have nothing," Whitfield said. "You have a charter based on lies enforced by men who burned homes and poisoned water sources, operating under the protection of a territorial judge whose authority does not extend to federal Indian land disputes. What you have is a federal investigation, Mr. Marsh. What you have is a cavalry escort and a federal Indian affairs agent with the authority to void your charter, seize your camp, and refer you to the federal circuit court for prosecution. Marsh looked at the warriors on the ridgeline. 60 riders, motionless, watching. He looked at the cavalry troopers. 12 men, armed, carbines ready. He looked at Whitfield. He looked at the cowboy. "Who are you?" Marsh asked the cowboy. The cowboy said nothing. Marsh's eyes moved to the satchel. He recognized the oilcloth wrapping, the same oilcloth Clara Holt used in her office to protect her instruments. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear. The recognition that a resource he had been counting on, the surveyor's silence, had been turned against him. "Clara," Marsh said quietly. "She kept them." "She kept everything," the cowboy said. Marsh looked at Dillard again. This time, Dillard shook his head. Once, barely visible, the same gesture he had made in the wash, but this time it meant something different. In the wash, it had meant, "We leave now." Here, it meant, "There is no version of this where we win." Marsh turned and walked back through the gate. He did not speak. He did not give orders. He walked into his office and closed the door. Dillard looked at the cowboy. The two men regarded each other across the dusty ground between the cavalry line and the mining camp, the former scout and the man who had stood on a ledge above him in the dark and told him to leave. "This does not change anything," Dillard said. "It changes everything," the cowboy said. Dillard held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned, collected Teague and the other men, and walked them back through the gate. The gate closed. On the ridgeline, Nantan sat his horse and watched. Beside him, Tsela watched. The old man's hand rested on Koda's shoulder, and the boy's rifle was across his saddle horn, and Etu sat behind his grandfather on the horse, with his arms around the old man's waist, and the valley that had been stolen from them was, in the space of one federal agent's reading of the documents, theirs again. The sun was dropping toward the Mule Mountains. The copper-tinted ridgeline caught the last light and held it, burning red against the darkening sky, the way it had burned every evening for 30 years, while the families who owned this valley watched it from their doorways. Whitfield turned to the cowboy. "I'll need the surveyor's testimony formally recorded, and I'll need the originals for the federal record. They're in the satchel. You're just handing them over. They were never mine." Whitfield looked at the valley, the warriors, the mining camp, the copper claim markers that would need to be pulled up before nightfall, and exhaled slowly through his nose. "I'll have my men start cataloging the camp's records tonight. If Marsh has anything else in that office, contracts, ledgers, correspondence, we'll seize it under federal authority." He paused. "You did a hard thing, riding 60 miles through desert on that horse." "I did a necessary thing." "Those are not always the same." The cowboy looked up at the ridgeline where Nantan sat. The Apache chief was watching him, not with warmth, not with gratitude, but with the recognition of a man who has seen another man keep his word, when keeping that word cost him everything he had to give. The cowboy did not wave. He did not signal. He simply looked back, and in that look was the acknowledgement that the meal in the wash, the walk to the camp, the ride to the fort, and the return with the cavalry had all been threads in a single weave. And the weave was complete. What Nantan said to the cowboy in those last minutes, standing in the valley that was theirs again, that belongs to the Apache. Whatever it was, the cowboy nodded once and did not speak for a long time afterward. By midday, The federal order had been posted in Bisbee's general store, the assay office, and the territorial land office. Whitfield's men were cataloging Marsh's camp, contracts, ledgers, correspondence, everything that Clara Holt had warned them to look for. The territorial judge had left town on the morning stage. The sheriff had locked the office and was not answering his door. Families began returning within the week. The first were the Yazzies, a husband and wife who had been driven from the valley 8 months ago and had been living in a mining camp near Tombstone, doing piecework for wages that barely covered their food. They came back with a wagon and 2 children and stood at the edge of the valley for a long time before driving down. Their house was still standing. Someone, one of Whitfield's troopers, acting on an order the cowboy had not asked for, had replaced the burned door with fresh pine. Others followed: the Gila family, the Nez family, the Benallis. By the end of the first week, 4 of the 6 displaced families had returned. Their land was waiting. The water sources, no longer poisoned, were beginning to clear. The copper claims equipment stood idle, rusting in the desert air, monuments to a scheme that had consumed 18 months and considerable money, and had produced nothing but suffering. Abel's house, the one Marsh's men had tried to burn and failed, stood unchanged at the edge of the valley. Coda had repaired the roof. Itu had planted something in the small garden plot. The cowboy did not ask what. Sela sat on the porch in the morning sun, watching the valley fill with light and people and the ordinary quality of life returning to a place that had been denied it. The cowboy stayed 3 days. He did not sleep in the house. He slept by the horse, under the limestone shelf where he could watch the ridgeline. Old habit. On the second morning, he was rolling his saddle blanket when Sela appeared in the doorway. They looked at each other. What Sela said to him in those last minutes, standing in the doorway of the house that was still his, that belongs to the Apache. Whatever it was enough. The cowboy nodded once, swung onto his horse, and rode north without looking back. He had no money. He had no food. His rifle had 30 rounds, and his horse had grain for 2 days. The valley behind him was filling with people who would rebuild what had been taken, and the 60 warriors who had ridden at dawn were returning to their own lives, their own families, their own mornings. The cowboy rode north through the Mule Mountains as the sun climbed over the ridgeline. The horse moved at an easy walk, reading the trail, ears forward. The air was cold and clear and tasted of limestone and juniper. Somewhere behind him, Coda watched from the porch of the house his grandfather had refused to leave, and the boy's eyes held the stillness of someone who has learned something important, not from a lecture, but from watching a stranger give away his last meal and then walk 6 miles through the dark to keep his word. If this story found something in you, subscribe to Frontier Reckoning. There are more stories here. Stories where the quiet man at the back of the room already has the answer. He always does.